I just wanted to briefly give you an understanding of what Menopause Pro is and why I decided to develop it. Because there is a gap within conversations. Certainly, I've noticed over the last 5, 6 years, there's a gap in conversations where there is a huge amount of skill that is available out there across the menopause world, so to speak. But menopause, although most of us who are working in that field, it feels like quite a tight bubble, but actually menopause touches all parts of our lives, as those of us who are experiencing it know. So we created Menopause Pro Roundtable because menopause doesn't sit neatly into one discipline, does it? It shows up in health, it shows up across HR, it shows up in law, leadership, productivity. It's all a lived experience of ours, let alone the hormonal side of that. It's everything else that it touches. And that's why I wanted to put a round table together, because collectively we can learn far more from one another, particularly when we're talking and having open discussions with people who come from various backgrounds, numerous industries. Let's all learn from each other. So that's pretty much what Menopause Pro Roundtable is. And we'll be covering various topics over the coming year or so, which I'll talk to a little bit later on. Primarily, this is to enable women to have a better experience through menopause. And the more knowledge that we can glean from one another, the easier it feels and the more connected we all feel. So there's less isolation. So we've got three wonderful guest speakers this evening, which is terrific. And I thank them all for attending. We're going to be discussing menopause in the workplace pretty much. But again, that's not there's no tight definition on that, is there? Menopause in the workplace, because it impacts differently for different women across different industries. And we're going to be looking at that and in different countries. And that's why we've invited one of our pros, Megan, who's in Australia, early start for her this morning, to talk about what's happening in Australia as well as in the UK. And Catherine, our third speaker, will be talking about what's happening in Scotland in particular. And Emma can give us an overview of the legal aspects of what's happening in England. So I'm just going to move on now to introduce you to Megan, or Megan can actually introduce herself, I'm sure. Megan's been with us for some time as a champion and has now been selected as a Menopause Pro. As I say, she's over in Australia. I think you're in Adelaide from memory, Megan. Terrific to have you with us. We've got some questions that I'd really like to put to you so that it gives us a better insight as to what's happening across the other side of the world, which will be very, very interesting. Would you like to just give people a bit of an overview of who you are, what you're doing right now in the menopause space? That would be very useful.
Yeah, sure. So, first of all, well, good morning or good evening to all of you. So, um, yeah, Megan Hayward. I started my menopause consultancy and training business, which is called Mimi Moon Meno, and registered myself as the first menopause concierge because for me personally, I hit menopause. I had absolutely no idea what was going to happen to me. No one in my life could tell me what was going on, including the medical professionals. And I thought, oh my God, Father, like once I worked out what was going on, that I was in perimenopause and started to get some help, I thought, for goodness sake, if everyone's going through this, why isn't someone doing anything about it? So that's why I started Mimi Moon Meno. That's a side hustle. I do still work full time and build houses, and I've got a couple of other hustles going on. But I'm extremely passionate about making sure that women in general do not have to go through what I went through, which was I was in the 20% of the extreme end of symptoms, a couple of redundancies. I was almost sectioned from depression. So I had a horrendous time and I just went, this is not right. Surely there's got to be a different way. How do I help other women not to have the experience I had. So yeah, that's what I do. So
Yeah.
sorry, I should finish off by saying in my consultancy space, the thing that I am most passionate about is the workplace, because as I said, I had a couple of redundancies. It was an extremely difficult time trying to work in executive roles and feeling like I'd worked really hard to get to that position, master's degrees, lots of study, lots of hours, you would all appreciate. And then to be made redundant because I was difficult. Um, I just sort of went, oh, for God, really, we've got to keep women employed. There's so many reasons why. But I just sort of went, being difficult is not a good enough reason to make someone redundant when all I really needed was a bit of support and flexibility. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, speaking as another difficult woman,
Yeah.
yeah, I'm sure that there's a whole host of difficult women that are attending. Yeah, yeah, hands up.
Yeah.
Yeah, you're all here. It is challenging, isn't it, out there? It still is. Years on, we've still got a huge amount of work to do. Now, I know that you were very involved with the Australian Senate inquiry into menopause. And that was just terrific. And anybody who wants to listen to that, that was in 2024, wasn't it?
Right. Yeah.
Yeah, and there's excerpts of that that are on our YouTube channel. So if anybody wants to have a listen to that, it makes for very, very interesting listening. And of course, what's happened is Australia now, as we're watching other countries from the UK, because we were leading the way for a long time before Australia, New Zealand, America, Canada, before everybody else was waking up to the menopause conversation, we were really quite ahead of the game. And so I'm interested in what's happening in Australia, which is why I invited you on, because I think it's interesting for us all and for those who are champions attending this roundtable, as well as the pros that are attending. It's good for us not to have a very, very closed mind on what's happening in the world. We can kind of think that everything is the same in every country when we know that it's not, and it can be very,
Mm.
very different. So, having some insight from you this morning for you, it will be really, really good, I think, for everybody who's listening. So, I'm going to go through a few questions. I know you've had them in advance, Megan, so it's been very helpful. But if you can just talk a little bit about that Senate inquiry that you were involved with, I think it would be very interesting for other people to know.
Yeah, so I think the best thing that came out of that Senate inquiry was that it really raised the voices of hundreds, I think in the thousands of women's experiences of menopause, both in and out of the workplace. But in the workplace, I think that was where the biggest impact has been made, because it became extremely apparent that we are losing highly qualified women at the peak of their earning career, which I think has become universally known in menopause. So, from the Senate inquiry, there were 25 recommendations that were handed down, but of those recommendations, the ones that really put a spotlight on menopause in the workplace was around data collection, flexible working arrangements, creating menopause policies, and looking at sexual and reproductive leave. So, very briefly, recommendation 5, we've got an organisation here called the Workplace Gender Equality Agency that reports on gender equality in the workplace, as the name suggests. So they actually used to collect data on what support was given to women in the workplace, particularly around menopause, and that got stopped. So it's been recommended that that starts again, and that employers provide demonstrate what it is they're providing for women in terms of support, how many women are using that support, and how that's changed the experience for women in the workplace. The next one was around, which is recommendation 6, and that was updating section 65 of our Fair Work Act to make sure that women have the right to flexible working arrangements during menopause, because the other thing that came out of the Senate inquiry was that a lot of women are actually leaving the workforce. It's 17% actually take an extended break out of the workforce in their peak earning period of life because basically they're not able to manage their menopause symptoms. Whereas if we were able to access flexibility, because we want to continue to work, we just need flexibility around how we're working to manage our menopause symptoms or settle in HRT, because as most of you will know, that's not always an easy process. So that's what recommendation 6 is. Recommendation 7 was around Australian workplaces actually developing perimenopause and menopause workplace policies in consultation with their employees. And just on that point, because that's quite a big process, and I do agree that is required in some workplaces, but when I'm consulting into organisations, I actually just say the quickest and easiest step for you to achieve this is to review what policies you've already got. So if you've got, for example, a sick leave, or some people call it wellness leave now, how can you include perimenopause and menopause into that policy so that women know that if they're working through some symptoms, they can access that leave to manage that symptom rather than going, oh, I'm not sick. So I'm not technically sick, as in I don't have a cold, so I can't use my sick leave. Like, how do you rearrange the wording to make it inclusive for everyone? And then the last recommendation that's specifically related to workplaces was just to review the impact and effectiveness of sexual and reproductive health leave, where it has already been implemented, both here in Australia and overseas, and to make sure that we've got paid gender-inclusive reproductive leave in the National Employment Standards. So, yeah, that's the 4 sort of main recommendations that came out of the Senate inquiry specifically for workplaces in Australia.
And they've been implemented, or
No, they haven't been implemented specifically because they're recommendations. So a lot of us are watching with bated breath what's going on in the UK with your menopause action plans, because I think that's a bold step and a step that needs to be taken. And at the moment, we're just in the recommendation phase. Yeah.
yeah, it'll be really interesting when Emma's talking then for you to listen to what's happening
Yeah.
from a legal perspective in the UK. So how are HR leaders in Australia responding to recommendations? I mean, is there a lot of chatter about this?
I think that's the best way to put it. There's a lot of chatter. Um, and obviously each business is different. So if you're a really tiny business, it's like, yep, we know what menopause is. We're just going to continue having water cooler conversations. Whereas if you're a really large business, then you're looking more broadly, how do we implement some of those recommendations and stay ahead of the curve? But really, the thing is, I find, so at the moment we're about to have International Women's Day. So I've had multiple inquiries to come and have a chat, do public speakings. People have reached out to say, how do we get workplace training around menopause? And for me, it's great. It's great that we have those days and those points in the year that highlight menopause as something that we need to talk about. But as we all know, it's not. Menopause is a 24/7 thing when you go through it. So I think the more people understand that, the easier it's going to be. But yeah, I'm finding that the support is still sort of remaining focused on more standalone things like, let's do a lunch and learn session. There might be an occasional webinar, or as I've said, we focus on days. So International Women's Day, Menopause Awareness Day, that sort of thing. But there is change, like there is certainly in the really big end of town. So, for example, Deloitte Australia is a global professional network. They have gone through a process to review all of their policies, and they have included menopause and perimenopause specifically throughout their, they call it 13 Ways to Flex. So they've included that explicitly, and another big group here called Future Group, which is a superannuation investment company. They've gone ahead and offered, in addition to all the other leave entitlements, 6 days paid leave per year for menstruation and menopause. So I think, particularly again with menopause action plans in the UK, where there's an international focus and a company works across borders, they're not going to have one standard for UK employees and one standard for Australian. They're going to go, let's bring the whole thing. This is good for everyone. And so let's make it global. Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, and where are you finding resistance, if anything? Is it with the leaders right at the top? Are you finding resistance within human resources? Is there, I mean, budget is always, of course, budget is always a considering factor.
Yeah, budget is always a factor. But for example, like my career is in construction. So I've worked in construction my whole life. And it's interesting because when I speak to men about menopause, they're interested. They want training. They want to know what's going on with their wives, and a lot of them actually want to know how to support their female staff who are really important within the business. What I'm finding is that I'm getting resistance from other women in HR who just don't want to talk about it. Like I've literally been trying to get into a particular building company to do training. I've got two senior men in that organisation that want to engage, and the female HR manager is not getting back to me. Even though these other two people are saying, can you please get back to me? It's just shut down. And so I find that it's still a belief, really, that at the private matter, it's perceived that if we start talking about menopause, well, what other things are we going to need to start talking about? What floodgates are we going to open? Of course, there's the additional leave provisions. Like, how does that impact already our bottom line? We're already giving people so much flexibility. And I think, even though there's this perception that men don't want to know, I don't think that's what it is. I think we do, and I'm using a broad brush here. There are some older women that I'm running into that are doing a disservice to other women because they've gone, well, I've got through it. And it's like, well, okay, that's good for you. But, really, if you took a step back and look at what your health is like at the moment, have you really done yourself a good deed? Or would it have been better if you actually got proper support, proper training, and proper knowledge in the workplace? How can we help other women not to be suffering how you are now? So, yeah, it's a bit of I find it's still a little bit of a hard sell, but when someone wants to do it, they go whole hog. So, yeah.
I think just broadening the education actually for women over 60 is vital
Yeah.
because in fact, even only today, somebody was talking to me about just past that. And I know that she's only in her mid 60s. And so there is this belief that, once their periods have stopped and maybe their symptoms have calmed down a little bit, although I do believe that many women they do not recognize those symptoms related to menopause. They still don't recognize it. And if they've had limited education, which they will have done, because as we know, this conversation is still very, very new, then yeah, I think that it's a conversation that I hear a lot about older women being quite dismissive because they kind of think that younger women are bleating about something that they've had to just endure and get on with. But
Yeah.
I do think that there's a case certainly for our champions that are out there and our pros that we need to broaden that conversation and try and encourage them to discuss it because I think, it's like all of us, we only know what we know, don't we? We know what we know. And we don't know what we don't know. And so as soon as we broaden the topic to older women and not just be relatable to those in their 40s and their 50s, but those in their 60s and their 70s who are still suffering symptoms, some of them, but not knowing that it's anything to do with menopause, the easier I think it's going to be. Yes, I'm certainly relate to what you're coming across in terms of resistance there. I think there's also an element of vanity as well that's still there. I remember when we first started Menopause Experts Group, there were women that took offence. They take offence at being called
Yeah.
or suspected perimenopausal. And that's if they know what perimenopause is. But if you're suspecting that somebody is going through menopause, there's still that vanity because this link to age, which
Mm.
of course we all know really is nonsense. It's not age related, it's hormones. So
Yeah.
broadening the conversation, I think we just got to keep at it, haven't we, until they get it. Um,
Yeah. Yeah.
until they understand it, because it's all long term for us. Well, it's forever, isn't it?
Forever. That's right. Yeah. No, I proudly talk about it. I talk about all of the symptoms because I just think it's so much. There's so much, as you said, that we don't know, but there's also so much that we go through in silence and in isolation. And I just wish other people had spoken about things with me. All the older women that I had in my life, I wish they'd been open about what they were experiencing so that when I was experiencing it, I didn't feel like there was something wrong with me. Do you know what I mean? And I think that's also part of the barrier is a lot of the older women that I'm speaking with have gone, whatever, they've processed it in a way that they don't want it to be something wrong with them if there's something wrong with you. Do you know what I'm trying to say?
Yes.
Um, yeah, and they don't want to be. And I come back to, my first redundancy, being told that you're difficult. They don't want to be that difficult woman in the workplace. They don't want to be that hormonal woman. There's so many labels that we get thrown in the workplace. They want to be that easy, steady, stable person that hasn't suffered with all those things that those other women are suffering with. And I think that's really doing a disservice, but with appreciation and respect as to why they're doing that. Yeah.
Yeah. That's why these conversations are so vital. Until
Mm.
we can remove that thought process of it being a fault. It,
Correct. Yeah.
that menopause is a fault, and that we're broken. So, looking ahead then over the next year to 2 years, what do you think realistically you can expect to see in Australia? Post Senate inquiry and all of these recommendations. What do you think, as an opinion? What do you think is likely to happen over the next year or two?
Well, I think it's happening. People are talking about it. People are becoming more aware about it. Younger women certainly want to know more about it and are reaching out for support. Our trade unions here in Australia did a campaign. It was off the back of the Senate inquiry, actually called "It's for Everybody," which was around incorporating reproductive leave into the national employment standards. So there's several industries now that have up to 10 days of paid reproductive leave. So I think, again, the more awareness that's happening, the more people are going, actually, we need to include this. And then I think, again, coming back to the UK with the menopause action plans, the more international, non-bordered organisations that bring in menopause policies and reproductive leave policies, the more Australia is going to start going, actually, we need to do something about this. So, and I think also with the Workplace Gender Equality Agency, picking up data reporting on, because they're reporting on the gap, the gender pay gap, and that's public information. Anyone can get up and go and have a look at it, and it was quite insightful for me, knowing that I'd been paid 20% less at one of my organisations than men. But anyway, when you're able to go in and actually view what organisations are doing, I believe that women will start making choices around, well, I want to work for an organisation that actually recognises this as something that's beneficial when it's supported. And so if you're reporting on it, you'll become an employer of choice. So I think, yeah, we'll start to see a shift in that way.
Yeah, and it's interesting as well that once that shifts, of course, younger women, as they're becoming a little more savvy and thinking forward, so if they're in their 30s and might be changing career, and they're going to be much more likely to want to be involved with a company who's progressive and looking out for
Looking at
health, because it's going to
Yeah,
impact imminently, isn't it, for a 30-something-year-old?
that's right. And I believe, like for me now as well, I look at organisations and I go, how many older women have they got in the organisation? How have they valued that intellect and knowledge and experience? And would they value me? Like that's, not just having a policy in place that says, oh, we're going to support you during your perimenopause, menopause, whatever your reproductive journey is. But are there actually older women there that are going to support me in the workplace and that have been supported? I think that's going to be a really telling sign in the future.
Yes, that's a really interesting viewpoint, isn't it? So, if you could advise UK employers then using Australia as a case study, what would you encourage them to do sooner rather than later, in your opinion?
Well, when Rona sent this question to me, my first response was, "Is this a trick question?" Because you guys, you guys are doing the menopause action plans, and I would say, I mean, you guys are ahead of us in that respect. And if I could flip the question around, what should Australia be doing? I'd be saying, come out of the recommendation phase of the Senate inquiry and make those recommendations mandatory because it goes beyond the Senate inquiry recommendations go beyond the workplace, of course. Like it goes into training our doctors, like GPs, specialists, all that sort of thing in menopause and how to support women and believe women. Like, heaven forbid, we might be believed if we've got something wrong with us and we're not being hysterical. So, I think actually Australia should be looking at the UK and going, well, the UK have put in place these menopause action plans. We have the recommendations, we've done the inquiry, we know what we need to do. So let's actually go out of that recommendation phase and implement all of those recommendations as mandatory things that need to happen in and out of the workplace in Australia. So yeah, I think you guys are doing a great job. We're watching you.
Great, great. Still
Yeah.
lots to do on both sides of the world.
Yeah.
It's a great way of introducing Emma O'Connor. Thank you, Megan. We'll catch up again towards the end of the roundtable session. Emma, welcome to you. Emma O'Connor, who's a partner and employment law specialist with Doyle Clayton law firm. Emma and I have spoken a few times. We've done a couple of webinars together on this topic, and there are lots of changes afoot. Emma, would you like to just give a little brief summary overview of who you are and uh, what you're doing right now, and what you can see then is what we're going to be talking about, the impact of law on menopause in the workplace?
Absolutely. Thank you very much, Dee. Good evening, everyone, and good morning to Megan as well. It's great to be with you. So, as Dee's very kindly said, I'm an employment lawyer. I've been practicing employment law for well over 20 years now. And what over the years my practice has kind of developed, I'm mainly an employer lawyer, so I tend to represent and employers. And really, my career's kind of pivoted from doing sort of lots of day-to-day employment law and tribunal work to basically going into companies and to firms and training managers on how to avoid tribunal claims and how really to support their people. And so much of my day job now is spent talking about law, but in a practical way, and trying to get managers, SLTs, and boards really aware of what is going on in the employment law world, but not just that, culture, engagement, leadership skills, all of those really valuable things. I think, over the years practicing law, I've definitely seen a real shift in emphasis. And I think that's, a lot of that is to do because there is a lot more law now, but I think people are generally a bit more savvy in terms of their rights. And I think businesses are becoming more aware of their responsibilities. I think, it's the expectations now on employers is not just, 9 to 5, Monday to Friday, you do a job and we pay you. I think there's a greater emphasis on working well, work is good for us, good work is good for us. And I think employers are changing their attitudes. And yes, they get the odd nudge every now and again by a complaint, a grievance, or a claim, or as we're seeing at the moment, lots of law. Um, I'm just interested actually, anybody on the call today in HR? No,
Can't see any
that's
hands.
good. I was just interested to see because it'd be quite interested to see where you are in your kind of if your businesses are kind of starting to think about obviously the big changes that we've got. Well, they've sort of started to happen already at the end of last year, but obviously that are coming up over the next couple of years.
Yeah, I mean, just to give some context into the conversation, there's new UK employment laws coming into force. Of course, we know we've been talking about this very recently, and menopause is increasingly intersecting with legal duty, which is what you were just saying, risk management and organisational responsibility. So, some questions that we're going to put to you this evening, then, Emma. So, from a legal standpoint, what recent or upcoming UK employment law changes are most relevant to menopause in the workplace, would you say?
Yeah, well, we've kind of sort of talked about it in the round, and Meg mentioned menopause action plans. I mean, there really is only one topic du jour when it comes to employment law at the moment, and that's the Employment Rights Act. Now, the Employment Rights Act passed finally after some, marathon parliamentary ping-ponging between the House of Commons and the House of Lords. It finally passed in December of 2025. And it really is Labour's flagship. It's heralded as, once in a generation change to employment laws. And it comes from the government's, white paper of making work pay and the impact of the Employment Rights Act from 2025 till 2027. So we've got this really long implementation timetable is going to be huge and it really impacts upon the whole employee life cycle from the way that we recruit, the way we onboard, so probation periods, to the way we manage our workforces and to the way that we dismiss our employees as well. So, it really can't be underestimated just how huge of an impact this is going to have on businesses and on employers. Now, one of the areas that the Employment Rights Act focuses on is menopause. And as Megan's alluded to, menopause action plans. It's actually gender pay gap reporting and menopause action plans. And as you know, we've had gender pay gap reporting for a number of years now. We've actually got the April snapshot date creeping up on businesses once again. So essentially, what the Employment Rights Act says is that employers with 250 or more employees will voluntarily from April of this year and from mandatory from October of this year. Mandatory from 2027. We don't know when in 2027 that's going to be, but we've just got this sort of broad brush in 2027, it's going to become mandatory. Now, we're pretty light on detail in terms of what those menopause action plans are going to look like. So in terms of, is it going to drive and is it going to generate great change? At the moment, we don't know. What we do know is that it's going to be an opportunity for those larger employers to set out their journey, if you like, their story from this is where we are now, and these are the steps that we are working to support those employees within the organisation who are going through menopause. I think it will include steps such as, we have policies, we have been undertaking training, I think it's going to be focusing on how effective have those measures been. I think a lot of the time, and I see this a lot with businesses, is they sort of, rush in headlong and sort of start doing all these wonderful things, but then actually not really focusing on has it actually achieved the thing that we want it to achieve. So I can see the menopause action plans actually being quite useful in terms of a monitoring exercise for businesses to see actually has the thing that we've tried to do achieved what we wanted it to. I don't think the menopause action plans are going to get employers to talk about statistics. It might get, I think it probably will involve some sort of sex-based statistics. So how many women do we have in the workforce? Because as we know, we can't, it's women at a certain stage, not a certain age. But I do think that there will be some, what's our current demographic? We see that now in gender pay gap reporting, how many men and women do we have? It might also be, and as we see with gender pay gap reporting, how many women do we have in certain positions? So how many women do we have in senior leadership? Because actually, I think that's an interesting statistic to have, particularly when we think about the conversations, obviously, that Megan was talking about in terms of the brain drain. So women feeling that they cannot remain in the workplace because they don't feel that the workplace is supportive for them. So again, we might see some statistics around perhaps exit data. And I always think exit data is an incredibly powerful tool for employers, and I don't think they use it enough. And that's exit in all areas, not just, women leaving the business. I think it's, all roles and sectors and ages leaving the business. So menopause action plans, voluntary from April 2026, mandatory from 2027 for businesses with over 250 employees. Now, that's not to say that businesses with fewer than 250 employees shouldn't be doing them. And actually, it's really interesting. I have a number of clients who don't reach the 250 threshold that actually do gender pay gap reporting. Now, some of them publish it and they're very open about it. Some of them actually use it for internal data to actually make sure that they are, making sure that their pay is transparent and open, and they are, they've got correct pay levels for particular, men and women in the workforce. So there is no reason why an employer cannot. I think that, employers that are open about this information, I think will, potentially attract more women, as Megan said. I think, candidates are much more savvy now in looking at the whole picture, not just hours, where am I going to work, what's the pay and what the benefits. I think, candidates are certainly much more looking at a much more holistic picture. Now, will menopause action plans change the world? Now, we know that gender pay gap reporting, whilst it is mandatory, there are no penalties. Okay. Now, are we going to see penalties for a failure to produce a gender pay gap, a menopause action plan? I think not. But sometimes the court of public opinion is sometimes greater than actually, somebody getting a fine or whatever. So I think that, not doing it could actually be worse than, getting fined for not doing it. What it will be, though, is used as evidence, I think, for individuals that are maybe bringing a claim for perhaps discrimination, because I think it goes to the culture. So if you've brought a claim or a complaint against your employer because they failed to support you, or, we can talk about, sort of legal risks. But I think it's quite good evidence that goes to the culture and what it is like to work in that organisation or in that team. So I think it's quite good evidence. So menopause action plans is obviously the big change, related to menopause, but there are also other changes in the Employment Rights Act as well. I think the main one and the main kind of headline is around changes to unfair dismissal protection. So at the moment, an individual, if they wish to bring an ordinary unfair dismissal claim, they need currently 2 years service with their employer. Unfair dismissal law is that statutory right not to be unfairly dismissed, and your employer needs a fair reason of which there are 5, so capability, conduct, redundancy, or potential fair reasons, and they have to follow a fair process. Huge change is the fact that from the 1st of January 2027, that 2-year window is going to be reduced to 6 months. So it's going to have a huge impact and potentially bring many more employees into that protective net than would otherwise have been able to bring a claim. And the other point about unfair dismissal is as well, at the moment, we have a statutory cap. So at the moment, we know that an individual can claim a maximum of 52 weeks pay or £118,000 as the compensatory award, and that's capped, so whatever is the lower amount. We are waiting as to which types of claims this is going to apply to. So, is it if you've been dismissed as at the 1st of January 2027, or could it possibly apply to claims that are already within the tribunal system? But effectively, that cap is being removed. And what that is really going to mean is that individuals who are higher earners, now unfair dismissal is actually going to be quite an attractive claim for them, because share incentives, bonuses, are high performing, high achieving individuals within an organisation who might have tried to bring a whistleblowing claim or a discrimination claim where we already have unlimited compensation. Again, it makes unfair dismissal claims, more attractive. The other point is another point, harassment laws. We're going to see some changes to harassment, in particular third-party harassment. So that's going to be brought in as a standalone claim. Changes to sexual harassment as well, but for these purposes, it would be harassment. So that would be comments from a client, customer, contractor around sex, so sex-based harassment, age-based harassment, race-based harassment. So this protected characteristic harassment, disability as well. So again, third-party harassment is going to be that standalone claim from October of this year, 2026, unless the employer has taken preventative steps, all reasonable steps to prevent third-party harassment in the workplace. We're also going to see some changes to flexible working requests as well, with the employer having to demonstrate that not only do they have a fair reason to say no, but also that they have acted reasonably in being able to justify why they have rejected a flexible working request. So lots and lots of changes. And we've also got some equality and human rights guidance as well. The ECHR, which is one of these sort of quasi-government bodies that produces codes of practice from time to time. They produce some guidance as well to support employers in recognising the impact that menopause can have on their people, and also sort of flagging some of the other legal risks there. And also ACAS as well produces guidance from time to time about supporting people in the workplace with menopause. So it's a huge, there's lots and lots of change that is coming in, and it's not just the menopause action plans. I think all the other peripheral things are as equally important when we talk about supporting women in the workplace, but also from an employer perspective, risk management and risk assessing.
Yeah, absolutely. I just thinking of so many old school company bosses now that will probably just be sticking their head in the sand and thinking, oh, botheration, this is really is really and a lot of them might be thinking that they can dodge it, ignore it. There'll be a lot of exposure, won't there?
I think there will, and I do think this court of public opinion, I think is where I think a lot of employers, I think it's going to discourage a lot of employers, particularly the larger employers, as Megan was saying, the global employers, the sort of the big boys and girls out there that have got, sort of transnational workplaces. And what's going to be very interesting is a lot of, particularly how Europe's going to respond to this as well. I know we've had, there's been some, changes in Spain, but it's going to be quite interesting if kind of Europe gets hold of these sort of ideas as well, because often what happens, so for example, we've got pay transparency regulations that are happening in Europe, and although we're not in Europe anymore, we find a lot of the time with our clients who've got particularly a European presence, that does sort of encourage them to sort of, increase the sort of scope of those rules for the UK with things around policies and practices because of economies of scale. You don't often want different parts of the business doing different things.
Do you think this would have still happened if we had been still part of Europe?
Who knows? I mean, this is a UK initiative. This was, the government, it was their big plan, making work pay. I don't know. It's very interesting because normally it was, in the bad old days, it tended to be, Europe passed a directive, and then when we would implement it, how successfully we implemented that directive sometimes left a lot to be desired. But it's very interesting. It was always Europe that would, a lot of the time, come up with new and innovative things. I'm thinking about, the working time regulations, the Equal Treatment Directive, which is where, but then again, we've had Race Relations Act, Sex Discrimination Act, Disability Discrimination Act. We brought in shared parental leave. So I don't know. I think it depends on how progressive maybe governments are.
Yeah, yeah, no, I agree. Um, uh, do you think that there's going to be a dramatic shift in tribunal cases? I mean, we've been seeing a rise gradually over the last 5 or 6 years anyway. Do you think that there's going to be a spike when these
I
new
think,
rules
I mean, at the moment, I mean, the tribunal system is, I mean, it's pretty much on its knees. There are so many cases anyway that are kind of within the system. I mean, in our own firm, we've got cases that are being listed 2027, 2028, when
Wow.
you've got facts that were, 3 or 4 years ago. So it's a really tricky time actually to be, wanting to bring a claim. This new law will undoubtedly bring more claims. I mean, the government estimated alone with bringing in unfair dismissal rights after 6 months service would impact 9 million. Sorry, it was 9 million people if they brought it in as a day one right. That changed during the parliamentary ping-ponging, and it was estimated that it would impact 6 million people. So 6 million people all having the right to bring a claim for unfair dismissal.
Yeah.
Um, you know, but who knows? But again, when we think about menopause, it's not just, you know, losing your job and bringing a claim for unfair dismissal. And employment law is such a nuanced field. You can't look at things in silos. So I think one of the main areas where we've seen cases and where we've seen development in the law in recognizing, menopause at work is actually been in the field of discrimination law. So discrimination law in the UK is governed by, well, with the exception of Northern Ireland, but is governed by the Equality Act of 2010. So menopause of itself is not a protected characteristic. So essentially the Equality Act protects certain protected characteristics if you either have those protected characteristics or you're perceived to have those protected characteristics, or you're closely associated with somebody who does have those protected characteristics. So that would be sex, race, age, remembering that age isn't just your age, but the age group to which you belong to. So it's got a wider net there. Disability discrimination. So a disability under the Equality Act is defined as a physical or a mental impairment which is substantial, which effectively means that the symptoms will last for 12 months, or if you have sort of pockets of symptoms, that will last for 12 months. And it must also have an impact upon your ability to carry out normal day-to-day activities, which isn't necessarily your job. So that's the definition of disability discrimination, and then religion and belief, sexual orientation, gender reassignments, pregnancy and maternity as well in certain circumstances. So the Equality Act is about protecting those individuals, as I said, protected characteristics, but also about protected behaviours. So direct discrimination, so appointing the man because they're a man and not appointing the woman because they're a woman. Indirect sex discrimination comes up a lot with things around working hours, working patterns. Um, so indirect discrimination is where an employer will have a practice or a policy that they apply equally to everybody, but it impacts substantially or to one particular group's protected characteristic group than another, and the employer can't objectively justify it. Harassment as well, so harassing behaviours, so unwanted conduct, creating this environment at work which is impacts upon your dignity, and harassing behaviours as well. Sexual harassment is part of that unwanted conduct of a sexual nature. And another big risk area for employers under the Equality Act is actually victimisation. And often in my own practice, I've seen employers that have been able to explain, so they have their innocent reason as to why they have not treated the individual unfairly because of a protected characteristic, but then they go and do something like they don't promote them because they've raised a claim, or they give them a terrible reference, or they don't give them the bonus that they deserved. And that's victimizations, that's retaliating against somebody who has raised a complaint or a claim about discrimination or harassing behaviours. So menopause of itself is not a protected characteristic, but where we've seen the law develop on this is very much around the symptoms. And the other really interesting thing about disability discrimination is that if you are disabled within the meaning of the Equality Act, your employer has a duty to make reasonable adjustments to create that level playing field. So what we found in quite a lot of the cases, and there has been, I mean, there has been, a complete, I did do some research, that they've trebled. So we had 64 cases in 2022, and now we've got over 200 cases, menopause related tribunal cases in 2024, 2025. So, it is huge, the amount of cases that have come, and they aren't just sex-based claims. They are age-related claims, and also disability-related claims. And also we see claims around harassment, comments, jokes, stereotypical comments and jokes, oh, you must be going through the change, and various, comments that people say that they think are harmless, but intention doesn't matter. It's the impact upon the individual. How has that impacted you, and has it created this hostile working environment? So there has been, a massive development when it comes to protecting individuals in the workplace, and that really has been driven by discrimination law.
Of course, one would hope that it doesn't impact on women's ability um, to obtain jobs as well, because I suppose, some employers, and it would be difficult to prove in a lot of cases, are going to choose the male counterpart, aren't they? Because they might think, or they might view that if menopause becomes too problematic as an employer, then it's simple, in the good old days, bad old days, whichever side of the fence you're on. When if you were fertile and an employer thought, well, you're going to be leaving soon, surely you're going to be having babies. This is the other end of the scale, isn't it? In that
It
they'll be
it
thinking,
is.
you're menopausal anytime soon. Goodness me, you're going to cause me. You're going to be difficult.
It's really interesting because this is my own view is that actually the Equality Act actually is going to create a lot of unintended consequences. I think you're absolutely right. One of the unintended consequences will be women perhaps at the latter part of their career, but also there are some big changes coming with regards to pregnancy and maternity leave as well, and restricting an employer's ability to be able to terminate employment in certain circumstances. So I actually think that there are lots of things in this Equality Act. Young people as well, in particular, young people, I think they're going to be massively impacted. Young people coming into the workforce. If you've only got, 4 months, 5 months to prove yourself, and you've never worked in an industry before, it's going to become very, very difficult for you to actually get over the probation period because the employer will not want you to reach 6 months service. So I think that's a big red flag. I think women, in their early part of their careers, because, if it's going to be more difficult to manage you because of all these rights that women have, because, you're pregnant on maternity leave and for a period of time after you return, I think that's potentially problematic as well. Yes, there are laws already for, with regards to redundancy if you're on shared parental leave, neonatal care leave, or adoption leave. So yes, we do have some of that, but this is broadening the scope potentially just for pregnant women. So I do think there's some real hidden little landmines in this piece of legislation, which I'm hoping that I'm wrong
Yeah,
about.
yeah, I hope so too. We don't want to be seen as even more difficult for being female. Really, really insightful. So, I mean, looking ahead then, do you anticipate menopause becoming more explicitly recognised in the UK? I mean, this kind of needs what I was saying about us being more
Yeah.
different because we're now out as menopausal women, so to speak.
I think it will. I think it will certainly for larger employers, particularly, with the menopause action plan. So I think, that so for larger employers, they've got to be focusing on it more. I can see, more employers asking for, specific menopause policies. I think, training as well. I think a big part of this is around awareness, actually, what does it mean? How does it impact people? And I do think it goes to, and also, looking at our flexible working policies as well. I think, again, flexible working is very much you have to make a statutory flexible working request and you have to, change your working hours and it's permanent. And yes, you can make 2 requests in a year, but it's quite formulaic. Whereas actually, if employers adopted a more flexible approach to flexible working, because a lot of individuals, whether you're returning from a career break or whether you just want, a bit of time because maybe you've got other things going on in your life, caring responsibilities or whatever, I think actually employers having a much more flexible and perhaps a temporary approach to flexible working, I think would help. And I think, certainly, risk assessments, I think thinking around the reasonable adjustment point. So if you do have an individual who is, disabled within the meaning of the Equality Act, again, reasonable adjustment. So what would that look like? And I do think, as Megan said as well, I think women do have to kind of get involved in the conversation as well, being open about things that you may or may not need or you might need at a certain time. And I think, if you have this open dialogue, it's always been my approach, particularly with things around flexible working requests. Actually, if you can go into that conversation as an individual with an open mind and have a plan B, I think that always kind of works with employers. Some employers are like juggernauts. They're quite hard to steer and turn. And I think as an individual, I've always found advising, individual clients, actually, if you can think outside the box and have a plan A, B, and maybe C, you're more likely to get what you want.
Yeah.
And I do think, this does go to leaders, our leaders, whether they're male or female. Um, I absolutely agree with your point, Megan. I do think there is a reluctance, in women to talk about these issues because, we're strong and we're leaders and we're role models. But actually, I think there is a shift in leadership. And I think empathy is a really big part of actually what we expect in our leaders. And I think that, engagement as well, when we think about the demographics now of our workforce, and in terms of, men and women, in terms of older generations working longer, I think it's just such a valuable part and people to have within your workforce. But again, are we kind of mentoring and supporting as well? So I think it's, we have to, sometimes you have to help yourself as well as the employer giving you the scope to be able to, do other things as well.
What do they say? The art of diplomacy is getting your own way.
Yeah.
It's very true, isn't it? Rather than battling or going to war. It's
Yes, exactly. And and I think, the law obviously gives tools and it gives levers, as in, levers to do things, and it gives people rights. And but essentially I think that from advising my employer clients, you would always want to avoid that. So what can you do and how supportive can you be to individuals? And I think, the Employment Rights Act, whilst it does give a lot of nudges to employers, I think it will, it's going to be really challenging actually for businesses.
yeah,
Yeah, it
yeah,
really is. But I'm trying to, in the talks that I'm giving to employers about the Employment Rights Act, I'm trying to say, in all challenge comes opportunity. And actually, I think there's a really nice opportunity actually to develop cultures that are supportive, are engaging, are inclusive. So that would be my message.
brilliant. Oh, it's very it's great to have these insights because obviously we don't work in your world, not everybody that works in your world. So that's the whole point of the round table, isn't it? Is for you to share that knowledge and just give us a broader understanding actually of what's happening across our sector, several sectors, many sectors. Thanks so much, Emma. That's really, really fantastic. And I'm sure everybody benefited or felt the benefit of listening to you speak. So now we're moving on to our final speaker of this evening. That's Catherine Hume. Catherine, I hope you're raring to go. I can see
All
there.
good.
Yeah, all good. Catherine's based up in Scotland, and so what I really wanted was some insight, really, and some clarity of what's happening in Scotland because living for the most part in England at the moment there does seem to be some disparity, I think, between England and Scotland and Wales, actually, I must say. But it's nice to have you with us this evening. Catherine's a champion of ours, but now has been selected as a Menopause Pro and helping us with our broader knowledge across the round table. So, welcome this evening, Catherine. I'll leave it to you to introduce yourself.
Thanks, Steve. Good evening, everyone. I'm Catherine Hume. I am currently self-employed. I own an organisation called Evolution Partnering, and I provide fractional directors into scaling businesses. In addition to that, as part of my menopause training, I've now developed and deliver menopause training and workshops into workplaces. I personally went through menopause in 2017, and at that point I was executive level within a corporate and resigned and stepped away from an employed role, and I've never returned to employment since. I found the wonderful world of entrepreneurship and self-employment. So from every negative comes a positive. So that's where I am at the moment. I can see huge opportunity and huge real chinks of light for us to be able to look at what we can do and how we can influence how these policies are adopted moving forward. And that's really exciting. There's a real sort of energy around that just now, which is really good.
Yeah, I mean, my perception is that Scotland is progressive, and I've seen that over the last few years or so. That's my perception. Of course, not spending any time in Scotland on the ground, so to speak. You would know more than me. Um, we've got some questions to put to you, and really, it is Scotland based. I know that you do work nationally as well, but this is particular to Scotland. So from your perspective, has Scotland done particularly well in terms of menopause awareness and workplace support? What's your opinion on that?
I think the approach has been quite different, and I'll try and sum it up, because once I started to actually formulate my response to your question, I realized just how complicated and how intertwined some of this was. So I think the best place to start is to say that our socio-political scenario within Scotland is the reason why menopause is more visible. It's driven by a few things. So the first is policy design and that public sector culture. We have a much higher percentage of population employed within public sector than anywhere else in the UK. I think that has an impact. And I think Scotland has very deliberately treated menopause as both a public health priority and a workplace priority. And there's real defined differences within policy. It's embedded in at government level into strategies, across women's healthcare plans, across work equality frameworks, across public sector HR practice. And I would describe it as a top-down, a joined-up approach. I think that the Women's Health Plan has real explicit menopause commitments within it. And that government-supported guidance is not only centralised, but it's quite prescriptive, which means it gets cascaded well because it's very clear. I think there's strong alignment between that health policy and workplace policy. And I would say we're less fragmented because we operate as one entity, as one country. And I think that's a significant difference. I think public sector cohesion and the influence of trade unions, I think that's not to be underestimated. There's across NHS, local authorities, education, there's that high density of unionised members. And I think that has its own gender equity initiatives that are much more likely to cascade. I think those coordinated HR frameworks that I described are much more standardised and utilised more frequently. And I think there's a lot more of what I'm going to call shared resource, so policies, training, communication. So rather than everyone reinventing the wheel, there's a lot of familiarisation around the same things across a wider network. So it's amplified, I think, and the combination of that progressive thinking and gender health and inclusion, I think, is much more obvious up here than it possibly is looking at UK as a rule of thumb. And you're right, Wales is also in a very similar parallel to Scotland because some of what we have is devolved power. Therefore, you've got a bit more influence over what you've got the capability to influence. But there's definitely more public funding towards women's health initiatives. I think that's quite obvious. I would say there's greater joined up media coverage. So that's much more cohesive too. And I would say there's a higher expectation on employers to actually engage because of that familiarity and repetition of message. And the other key thing that I think is not to be underestimated is our NHS is one organisation. It's not regionalised. So NHS Scotland is the standalone. There's no variations. So again, it's faster, it's standardised, we're smaller as a nation, it's much more integrated. So there's, there are a lot of reasons why, and then other things feed into that. So things like third sector, that sort of interconnectivity between women's health and workplace equity. I just think it's much more amplified and much more visible. And then you could argue that we're a much smaller nation. We're only 5.5 million people. I think scale has a lot to do with this. It's easier to create visibility when you've got a smaller scale to work with. So that works in our favour and in our advantage in terms of whether it's health campaigns and reach and saturation in terms of mass public awareness. I think is just much easier here than it is. There's consistency. and that creates societal influence in terms of both awareness and people creating that demand for better standards and better, whether it's in the workplace or whether it's externally to that. So I think there's a lot of variations, but I do think a lot of it's to do with the fact that it's all joined up and cohesive and top-down approach.
So before we all pack our suitcases and move to Scotland, which I'm sure is crossing our minds right now. Tell me where the downsides are. Then you've given all of the upsides. There must be employers that are falling short somewhere down the line.
Yeah, I think that there's no doubt about that. I see regularly what I'll call the policy that's in place, but the lived experience and the behaviours within that organisation don't illustrate or demonstrate those policies. And that can be from corporate right through to SME. And I'm a great believer that what we're trying to do, and I've got an absolute rule of thumb, I think you know this, Dee, I won't work with an organisation unless they'll let me in at board level first. If they don't want me to engage with board and the board don't want to engage with creating an open forum and giving consent and permission to the remainder of the organisation, I won't work with them. I'll recommend them to someone else for menopause support, because this for me isn't box ticking or policy writing. This is about making a difference and making it normalised and open and progressive in terms of what we can do to make a difference. Megan mentioned earlier, I don't want other women to have to go through what I personally went through. And the whole reason I joined Meg was simply because I couldn't find accurate, data-backed information that I truly trusted and believed. So I think what we've got now is the power to share what we've got absolute conviction and belief in. And that's important to me, because from an integrity point of view, I don't want to work with employers that aren't in that same mindset or that same willingness to want to make a difference. So I think it's creating those safe spaces to discuss, but from board level right the way through the organisation. So that's, I think, where we fall short currently.
So where do you think, so devolved governments then, Scotland and Wales, of course, where do you think that they could step up to accelerate menopause-friendly practices across public and private sectors?
I think Emma's already emphasised the Employment Rights Act. I've spent 2 years delivering fractional HR directors into scale in SME. So I've been actively watching the ping pong, as she described it, really hoping we would get it through as we hoped. And I see that devolved power. We've got huge trade union influence. We've got an NHS that's one entity. We've got government policy that cascades quicker. I absolutely think that we've got a huge opportunity to do something really powerful with this. And any time I have an opportunity to talk to someone who is either in a political environment, maybe that they're in trade union circles, I actively ask what they personally are going to be doing to bringing this further up the agenda and to be able to actively engage. I'll offer my services to do free talks or to deliver free information or simply to supply some free tools and documents that might well be able to help them get others to understand why this is so critical. I think the Employment Rights Act and the Equalities Act will all have an impact. The interesting thing is going to be seeing how quickly the impact from government and NHS and that coordinated approach has that washed through to the other businesses, not just the 250 plus employees, but to the others, because there'll be in public expectation. The message gets through, it lands quicker, the expectation is greater. And I'm really looking forward to see how that's amplified and how that washes through before it becomes compulsory at some point in 27.
What would you like to see happening in Scotland in our menopause field? It's a much bigger acreage, isn't it, now, as we're opening up the conversation and talking about all sectors involved across our lives, and touching the threads that come out, the tendrils, as I call them, that come out of menopause and touches into all sorts of industries. What would you like to see happen in Scotland progressively over the next couple of years?
For me, it would be that board engagement. And I think regardless of what the demographic of that board is, what I've found most recently, and I'm sure I've put this in my last menopause newsletter, but I've now got 400 men subscribed to my menopause newsletter. So, and it worked out about just over 30% at that point in time. Now that's a shift change in behaviour. 2 years ago, that would never have happened. And the men I'm talking to and the men I'm coming across and the men who attend sessions, they're men of all ages. They can be my son's age and be in their mid-20s. They can be, chaps in their early 40s who clearly are beginning to experience menopause at home. And sometimes it's managers and leaders who are within businesses and very much genuinely interested because they don't have the knowledge, they don't have that arsenal of how can I approach this in conversation? What am I allowed to say? What shouldn't I say? And just the basics of what is menopause, what is perimenopause, really basic educational things that we could have been covering this off generations before, and when we're doing menstrual education and sex education in schools.
Yeah.
There's so much more of this could have been covered much earlier. And I talk now to women in their early 30s about preventative. How can they amend lifestyles and change things and forward plan? How are they going to handle perimenopause and what can they try to make easier by the time they get to the stage where symptoms are at their peak or at their worst? So for me, it would definitely be engaged from board level, regardless of the profile and regardless of who they are. And that's my aim for the time in Scotland in terms of focusing on those larger organisations as well as the SME, because there is definitely an interest from smaller businesses than 250.
Yeah, I agree with you. And I think we've all just got to play our part and make spaces safer for women to openly talk about. I mean, we were talking earlier about older women perhaps not being as supportive, and perhaps, and it's an assumption here, perhaps they feel that we shouldn't be whinging and moaning about our menopause because they had to put up with it. Or is it fear? Because of course, you get a lot of resistance when people are frightened to speak out and talk about their own experiences. So I think just making everywhere a safe space, which of course is what the champions do, making spaces safe for women to openly talk, and that reaches right across commerce, doesn't it? It really does.
The industry or the sector makes absolutely no difference. From retail right the way through to whether it's legal firms or whether it's engineering or manufacturing, the reaction is the same. And some of the best sessions I've had have been with all male audiences because they've then got a safe space to talk about experiences at home or experiences with team members, and they've got the camaraderie of other men around them. And the feedback is always there's so much we didn't know, and there's so much I've learned, and there's so many things now I would look out for, and I might better be able to join the dots rather than assume it's a performance issue or it's a sickness absence issue. So I think it's much broader than just menopause. It's that entire, what's the lived experience within a workplace, and how can we just make sure everyone is informed and we leave a footprint of tools to be able to help those conversations.
Yeah, I mean, we know that it's all very early days and the conversation is still very still in its infancy, let's say. And in another 10 years, we will have moved on leaps and bounds, and therefore those women that are in their 30s now, it's going to be a very different landscape for them. And that's why we should be educating women in their 30s. I mean, most of us would say, right, what age would we like to go back to, where we could perhaps impact our own health pre-menopausal? And I think most of us would say it's probably around 30. So, that education of women around 30, I just think is absolutely critical. We've just got to work with what we've got left, most of us, and make the best of it. But educating those that come after us is going to be key. Now, what other questions have I got down here? Because I know you've covered an awful lot. Um, Organizations moving beyond policy. Now, this is something that Megan and Emma both touched on, because of course we've got to be careful that we're not just trying to get policies introduced in the workplace. It needs to be an entire culture shift, mostly, not just policy driven. And so changing those old-fashioned thoughts and views is going to take, I think it's going to take decades, because we're almost waiting for those people with the old-fashioned views and opinions to retire. It feels like that sometimes.
I would agree. For me, the key issue isn't policy. Like most things, a policy is just a document, and if you're just going to file it or put it on your HRIS system for someone to read at some point later, then you're kind of missing the point of what this is designed to do. We're still the fastest growing demographic in the workplace. That's not going to change. And going back to something you said about older women and their perception of our menopause, if I wind the clock back and look, my mother didn't have the kind of career I had. She didn't have the pressures of life I had. It was just a different time, and financially as well as culturally, different expectations. And I think when you look at that shift change from, my mother's generation to mine, it's just leaps and bounds. The types of careers my mother and her friends had versus the types of careers I and my friends have are just radically different. The financial expectations, how many homeowners were there in the UK as a percentage then versus now? There's so many additional pressures now that weren't there. And I think people are living longer. We've got situations where a lot of menopausal women now have caring responsibilities for aging relatives. I'm still in that. I've been doing that between our four parents since 2016. We've sadly lost two of our four parents, but that nursing period and that convalescence period and that an adult being available to support always fell on my shoulders, not necessarily my husband's shoulders. Not for any reason other than there was more convenience and capability for me to do it because I already had a son who was younger and I already did some of the convenience of times, etc. So I think that there's a real shift, change in behaviours and expectations and finances, etc. within the world now that just weren't there then.
Yeah, we're going to see it again for the Gen Zs now when they reach menopause. Of course, they're going to have a even different experience because of the technology that's being introduced into healthcare. That's going to impact massively on hormonal health as we, go over the next 10, 20 years. So they will be having, roundtable discussions, I hope, talking about their menopause and how then, because there will always be improvement, won't there, in health. We're always going to be progressive in healthcare. We're always going to be looking for improvements. And yeah, goodness only knows what that's going to look like in the next 20 years. But
absolutely. And I think detection and identification of symptoms is already improving. The thought, even just in 2017, of going and having a suite of bloods taken, I think my GP would probably just have fell off her chair had I asked for that. Now that's just standard. You'll happily part with some money, you'll do some home blood, and you'll post it off. The world has just changed and moved on, and there's we've got symptom checkers, but there are now digital versions in femtech products that are doing that and tracking data and providing that real-time data that you can then take to a GP and actually give them, here's the data. It's there's no argument and no open to any nuance of someone's opinion. It is cold, hard facts with time stamped data. So yeah, I think there's some exciting things coming.
Yeah, really exciting. I think it's still a very, very exciting topic, menopause, and doesn't show any sign of being at all boring. More difficult, perhaps. More difficult. Will become more difficult, but not so boring. Okay, so predictions then. Your predictions over the next 1 to 2 years. So let's look at the immediate future. What do you think is going to happen in Scotland across this area?
I think for me, the sort of biggest issue for employers currently isn't who they'll employ, it's finding the right people with the right skills to employ. So there are huge gaps across the sectors and real specific skill gaps. And for employers, if they want to have an attractive employer brand reputation where employees want to come and work for them, they're going to have to do something different, stand out, and offer something different that's not there. And I think it's looking at the other end of the spectrum. Once they've got employees, do they still want to be losing their most talented, experienced people as that skill bucket is dripping and emptying and there's nothing filling it up at the top? I don't think they do. I very much can see a different attitude to how do we retain staff and how do we make the workplace a better place to be where people want to stay and they want to stay associated with that brand. And that's a big win if you're an employer. If you can seal the bucket and stop the retention and the leavers exiting, and at the same time, you've got a much nicer employer brand proposition for people to want to come and work with you. So I think there's a real place for those people that are going to be front runners in terms of taking policy into something that changes culture and absolutely puts a stamp on this is how menopause should look. And it's right the way through from board, right the way through to qualified menopause champions, and having it as part of an onboarding and an induction process so that everyone's aware of it. It's openly talked about. It's stamped through that red thread of DNA that runs through that organisation. So I do think we'll see some front runners that will really take this and make it something different. There are a couple already who behave differently and who absolutely have put some conviction behind menopause policy, separating out sick leave, giving additional leave for menopause symptoms, having what I would call extended benefits in terms of how they behave as a business and how they're prepared to accommodate menopause and what types of reasonable adjustments they are prepared to offer. Much more flexible and much more forward thinking than many most. So that's my
Look at how it impacts their bottom line as well, which of course most business leaders will be most interested in. Firstly and foremost, that's what they'll be looking at. But then hopefully there'll be the progressive leader, as you say, that sees it as an opportunity to retain talent. There's a skill shortage. We know that. There's a huge skill gap. Okay, that's just fantastic, Catherine. Thank you so much for talking about what's happening in Bonnie, Scotland. That's been really very insightful, and all three speakers. It's been terrific to hear your insights where you are. So, Megan, I'm just going to come back to you for any final words. A couple of sentences on how you're feeling right now, what you might have gleaned from this evening's round table, and what you might like to add.
I'm going to say that I am going to continue to embrace my difficultness. That's how I feel after this conversation. I'm like, difficult, yes. I'm going to keep this conversation about menopause like very exciting. And I think hearing the other speakers this morning, sorry, I'm talking like you now, because it's really dark here at the moment, but just hearing the other speakers today has really, it's just inspiring to know that there's so much happening around the world and that there are, I know that we're around the place, but to hear other people's passion in this place that, you know, mirrors my own is it's great. It's just so great, and I feel very inspired. I'm so glad I got up at 5 a.m. to join the conversation. So thank you so much, ladies.
I'm very pleased that you got up as well. Phew. And Emma, I know it's been a long day for you. You've been working all day, and now it's 9 o'clock in the evening. Any final words from you?
I'm just going to repeat my mantra, which is in all challenge comes opportunity. Just got to look for it and grasp it.
Indeed, indeed. Now I echo those sentiments completely. Catherine, last words from you.
Let's keep infants on board and SLT.
Okay, that's great. Now I'm just going to talk about future topics that we've got coming up with roundtables. Some will be in the public domain, others will be for round tablers only. We are next roundtable, we're going to be talking about the funding issues, the funding gap for female founders. For those of you who'd be interested in that, got some guest speakers lined up, and the equity gap. Really interesting conversation that will be. Lots of female founders now being born in their 50s, more than ever. But of course, there is this funding gap for female leaders as well. So we're going to be talking about that. Future topics, fertility, which you might expect, fertility issues, and the rise that we're seeing in fertility issues, the rise in endometriosis, POI, etc., early menopause. We'll also be talking about surgical, medical menopause, and patient advocacy, which will be interesting. And the big three, that's going to be coming up as well in a few months' time. Heart, brain, and bone health, really, really important. I'm really looking forward to that roundtable. We'll also be talking about hormone replacement therapy and including testosterone therapy, which is sort of headline news. It keeps popping up on my feed all the time now. Never talked about a few years ago, but of course it's talked about a lot now. So we'll be talking about that on the roundtable too. And also women of colour and the disparity in health care and workplace. Huge disparity in care there across the menopause world. And then much end that back end of the year, we will be talking to and with male allies, and we'll also be talking about the impact of menopause on families. A good topic for us to have. You know, we most of us live with them, and we probably find they can't live with us right now. But yeah, we'll be talking to male allies and family members, and I think that's really, really important. And then we'll also just be keeping up to speed with what's happening in terms of research and development in women's health, because it feels like it's running at the rate of knots at the moment. I know it isn't, but when you've come from ground zero and we've had nothing, and now it feels like it's becoming very progressive. So we're just keeping our ears to the ground, and of course that's part and parcel of why we have a round table as well to discuss research and development too. So all really, really exciting coming forward with the roundtable. And for those of you who've joined us and have been selected as Menopause Pros, I congratulate you, and it's lovely to have you with us. For the rest of our guests this evening, thank you for joining us. For our three speakers, thank you so much for giving up your time. I know that it's very early, very late, wherever you are, but great to see you all, and thank you for supporting the round table, and onwards and upwards, and be as difficult as you can be. Enjoy, and I'll see you again soon. Thanks very much, everybody.
Thank you very much. Thank you for inviting me. Thank you.
Bye.